Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the collaboration album between L'Orange and Solemn Brigham called Marlowe. So I'll freely admit, I don't cover or listen to a lot of instrumental hip-hop. I'm not against it by any stretch, especially when the producers bring in a more grainy, textured collage of samples that can have its own distinctive personality and tone, especially if there's vocal snippets. That is so up my alley, but it's the sort of thing for which I need to be in the right mood for it, and where I want to do my due diligence ensuring I understand the producer's foundations for where they pull those samples, which can involve some lengthy listens and backtracking. And such was the case for L'Orange, a producer affiliated with Mellow Music Group, has been steadily putting out instrumental projects and collaborations with MCs across the 2010s, and I'll admit, I might be more of a fan of his production than the rappers he brings on board. Yes, even that project with Kool Keith. There's a warmth and an aged grime to L'Orange's collage of samples pulled from old movies, and an uncanny knack for blending them into low-key but remarkably catchy grooves and melodies. Some people have cited comparisons to Madlib, but across more projects, I'd argue L'Orange's work can feel a little bit more cohesive and understated, pulling from a different, older set of reference points for his recontextualization in his pieces. So much so that I would argue that some MCs just aren't in sync with the same level of thematic ambition. I honestly prefer more of his instrumental projects. Now, he's definitely had his high points. My favorite would probably be the Mad Writer, although last year's The Ordinary Man had a special kind of magic to it, for the best way of describing that. So I was kind of optimistic when he saw that he was teaming up with Solemn Brigham, who had done some reasonably well on his features on that last album, and were set for a full-length, self-titled collaboration under the name of Marlowe. 17 tracks, but clocking below 40 minutes to keep this surprisingly brief. I was definitely curious where this could go, so what do we get from Marlowe? So alright, here's the thing. This album is paradoxically both easy and difficult to review, as I discovered to some of my exasperation when I saw some critics pull the whole, well, it shares some creative DNA with Mad Villainy, and says the word mad a couple times on the second song, so it's clearly derivative of Madlib and MF Doom. Ergo, I don't have to put in the time to analyze the content or the layering of the samples, just say that there are bars here. And yet with every listen I gave Marlowe, the more that just did not really feel like the case at all, especially when you dig into more of the details. Partially because Solemn Brigham is a very different MC than MF Doom, and partially because there's a very different twisted tone and progression to Marlowe. If Mad Villainy was the progression of the creepy, unstable weirdness of MF Doom, Marlowe might share some of the instability, sure, but there's a much greater sense of panicked, desperate urgency that honestly reminded me a little bit more of Danny Brown than anything else. And I do mean that as a compliment, because this project is actually really damn great. Now, to be fair, I do understand where some of the Mad Villainy comparisons might be rooted, at least on the surface, and especially when you consider the structure of the thing overall. The samples, they're a kaleidoscopic blend flitting across some abbreviated cuts that commonly slide somewhere around the 2-minute mark. The crackling fidelity of the voices and the vocal samples nearly always shifting, especially against Solemn Brigham's slightly sing-song delivery, intended at the very least on the surface to cultivate a warping, claustrophobic tone designed to throw you, the listener, completely off balance, but kind of keep pulling you in regardless. But you know what? Even in that, Marlowe's brand of unease, it's less alien than Mad Villainy's, in a big part thanks to the collage of samples that L'Orange brings that are less gleefully anarchic kitsch curated from the underbelly of forgotten weirdness, but again pulling on the tableau of old movies in a smoky neo-noir vibe, less the mad writer burrowing into his lonely corner or the consummate illusionist of The Ordinary Man, and more the madcap vaudeville showman with his ambition amplified by sheer desperation to pull this off in a world that's stacked up for our protagonist to fail. And while some of the samples might recall some B-movie kitsch, it's adjacent to the manic intensity of the more up-tempo soul or jazz samples bring to the table. The unsettling creepiness of Mad Villainy was more deliberate and controlled, pulling the listener into a twisting rabbit hole with that patience and a little bit more restraint. To put it bluntly, Marlowe's rabbit hole doesn't quite run as deep, and while you could argue that becomes a bit of an issue, we'll get to it when we talk about the lyrics, it does make the project feel a little bit more human, a little bit more relatable, maybe even a little bit more accessible. And a huge part of this is Solemn Brigham himself. And I'll say it, this guy is a find. Terrific technical construction to his bars, but married to a more melodic flow and delivery that might not feel as off-kilter as the Old Dirty Bastard they references, or really Danny Brown in that vein, but it's still catchy as tell. I can see some similarities in the flow. And it's also why I would absolutely disagree when some people say this album doesn't have hooks. Beyond the heavily textured and melodic focus in the production, Solemn Brigham's natural charisma and ease in connecting his rhymes and flow does wonders for making his choruses, which there are some, it makes them really damn sticky. I come back to a lot of these tunes, even if they are pretty short. Now granted, if I'm gonna cite an issue with this record, it would probably come with some of the content. And while I definitely appreciate this is Solemn Brigham's first big shot on a project like this, and he certainly shows up more strongly than so many other debuts in hip-hop I've heard, it's hard not to feel like he's being a bit overshadowed by the flair and color of L'Orange's production. We'll come back to this. Now, to be fair, this has happened with nearly every MC that's worked with L'Orange, and I'd argue that he holds his own a little bit better than most, but a little bit more lyrical detail in his storytelling and wordplay would do wonders in making his sharper punchlines and wittier moments and technical strength really jump out at you. I do like how his more braggadocious style tilts into an exasperated desperation that does a lot to humanize him though, as he seems plainly aware that not only is the world set against him, but also against his brand and style of hip-hop, which is twisted, wild, more than a little bit unstable, a little bit off-kilter, and he knows it. And that leads into kind of a manic-depressive vibe, where his struggle is almost as much roping in the audience and holding them long enough to see past the moments where he will skid off the rails like he describes on Palm Raiders, or just sink into a morose, brooding basement of ideas on, well, Basement. And once you clue into that headspace, it can be a real trip just riding off the flows and the charisma or well-connected wordplay. You just gotta let it roll over you. It really connected for me there, until you start wondering where it's all gonna go, where the deeper tension might lie. He's pulling us into this area, so what's there? What's so compelling? And yet in the second half of this album, that's where things kind of get intriguing. The funny thing is that Solemn Brigham knows that the audience that will be hooked through noir stylism alone, that audience is kind of capricious. And he's too pragmatic of a rapper to sell something that's not altogether real. So in the final third of the album seems to have him racing through his mental Rolodex to see how long he can hold that attention from the audience before somebody calls him out. And by the time we get to Mayday and Gone Believer, or even the samples before that, he usurps some of that position to call himself out, for better or for worse. He'll freely admit he tries a little bit too hard, oversells things a little heavy, and is now openly exasperated at a lack of greater progress and success. And I'll freely admit that connects with me a little bit more than I'm personally comfortable, but hey, I appreciate that. And the dogged determination he still has to keep going in his lane, that's got a lot of charm. Or maybe just burrowing back into his own sealed off space, that works for him too. I get that hermetic impulse. So yeah, sure, it's a more subtle story, it's being told more between the lines, but then you pair it with L'Orange's production, which does intensify the understated human element, but also amps up some of the performative artifice, as was common from the less naturalistic sample palette that calls back to those older movies and a less naturalistic style of acting, which makes you think that Solemn Brigham could have brought a little bit more lyrical flair and detail in order to match that style, because for as good as his flows and delivery are, I'm still here most for the production, I gotta admit it, and L'Orange is bringing some great stuff here, pulling from a grab bag of jazz, psychedelic soul, and grimy hip-hop tones that allow a remarkable amount of distinctive melody and tone. Hell, it might be short, but Cold Open is a prime example, if only to show the clash between that burnished guitar line and the rich horns, and then the transition to the rattling guitar spikes against the crackling beat and the cushion of bass on Lost Art. It's damn near superb, really like that song. And it's hard not just to list the highlights for me, from the jazzy squonk, the crashing cymbals, and the phenomenal drum pickup on Honest Living. It builds some weedy density, especially in the percussion on Demonstrations, especially with that scuzzy guitar in the background and some of the bass touches, to the lurking, deeper guitars of the Basement that almost pick up some surf rock touches on Palm Raiders. And while the horns, they will come back in earnest by Medicated against the chopped up hook, and then again with the panicked boom bap gallop of Fred Sanford and Mayday, what really pulled me in were some of the more distinctive, weirder sides, like the seedy whistles and organ flooding through Things We Summon, or the closing stuttered gallop on The Places We Stay. It was a pretty killer piece against some of those darker samples, and it's really quite a nice way to use those samples to end out the album, although I will say if I were to criticize L'Orange's production, it would be that when he simply loops a vocal sample and doesn't add much else beyond the beat, the cleaner fidelity of Solemn Brigham's tone doesn't always quite feel as comfortable as it should against that, and that's not counting the point where he will chop up the song in order to place his samples more to the forefront instead of the bars. remiss, which highlights the contrasting styles and it doesn't quite feel as cohesive as it could. I'm not quite sure that all of it really comes together, or he's found the MC to really match his production style and the weird places he takes his samples. But as a whole, great collaboration with a ton of easy replay value for me, terrific flows, a sort of textured melodic production that's sticky as hell with plenty of wit nestled in between the bars and the samples, and a blend of wry self-awareness and dogged drive I found really charming. It's not for everybody. I think old school hip-hop heads will have a lot more fun with this, or if you're into more of the underground scene, and I'm not sure I would put this quite among L'Orange's best if I'm being brutally honest, but still a lot of fun, and a really promising introduction of Solemn Brigham to the scene. I'm looking forward to see more out of this guy. So for me, 8 out of 10, absolutely recommendation. It'll fly under the radar or get dismissed by a lot of folks and sadly some critics, but believe me, if anything I describe here sounds up your alley, you're gonna want to get on board. Trust me with that. This is pretty fun. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm a little surprised I had this much to talk about with this review, but yeah, this is some really good stuff. I really enjoyed the hell out of this project. It's a little weird, it's a little off-kilter, but yeah, I just love the flows, and there's a lot of charisma here to really pull me back in. You want to buy the record, and I highly recommend you do. Links down there below, and I got the poll up there. I'm curious where people fall on this, especially with some of the comparisons I made, and again, L'Orange isn't quite for everybody, and although I think the flows will be enough to pull people in for this record. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help support this channel so I cover more stuff like this, link to my Patreon right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there. But if you want to see my schedule, it's on my Instagram, link down there below. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.